So later today, lawmakers will vote on a bill addressing the rising number of hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans. And as incidents continue to spike, many Asian American parents are forced to face uncomfortable realities and how best to discuss discrimination with their kids. One of those parents is New Jersey Congressman Andy Kim, who published his thoughts on why he will be sitting down with his 5-year-old son to talk more about discrimination and identity. Congressman Kim joins us now to discuss this article and other issues. Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman. When I heard about this, I thought about the talk that every black parent and kid knows about. I received it from my mom when I was a kid, and now I'm a parent, and I understand the discomfort when it comes to approaching these sort of topics with your own child. I got to do it with my kid. So you mentioned in the article that you were getting ready to have that talk with your son. I'm just curious, have you had the talk? If you have, how did it go? Are you still sort of formulating the talk, and what's coming to mind?
Yeah, well, thank you for talking about this topic here. For me, I've kind of laid out a kind of a 3-phase effort that I'm trying to do when it comes to talking to my kids. So the first phase, which is what I'm doing right now, I say it's about being proud and having pride. I want my son to learn my family history, to learn what it means to be Korean American, what it means to be Asian American. I want them to learn the heritage and come at their understanding about race from a source of pride. Then I will do the second phase, which is preparation, try to prepare my kid for some of the challenges, some of the bias, discrimination, the racism he may face. And then the last one is about perspective, which is about making sure that I teach him not just about the struggles that he will have, but teach him about the struggles others have in others' communities, and make sure that we stand up against hate in all forms, and make sure that we check our own biases and our privileges. So that's the way that I'm trying to engage with this with my wife, and we're working through that process right now.
Congressman, I thought it was so profound and moving. I know you spoke to my colleague Elaine Keano about this, and in her reporting, in the discussions that you had with her, you said this: the question for us and our generation is, are we going to accept that there's just a certain baseline of foreignness and xenophobia and discrimination that we just have to accept? And I say no. You say no. This is a moment for us to feel empowered. How do we get beyond that, though? You say no, but clearly these problems still exist, and they are not new. I think what's new is that we're talking about it now, Congressman, and that the AAPI community has become extremely vocal in the wake of some of the discrimination that we've seen over the last couple of years. But this goes back practically, I mean, it goes back as far back as the founding of this country, which is the experience that many African Americans and other people of color have had in this country. And there were laws just the same way that there were laws preventing African Americans from voting and living their lives. What do you see as that change that so desperately needs to happen? Have you seen any of it?
Well, look, this is a very deep cut in our community. This is not something that any single law will be able to pass and get rid of. This is something that we need to make sure we're addressing across the board. You're right. This is something that doesn't just get at the challenges that the Asian American community faces here, which is why I say it's so important that we commit to standing up against hate in all forms. And that when we talk to our kids, that's for everyone in this country to talk to their kids about, regardless of the color of their skin, about the challenges not only that they may face, but others will face, and making sure that we are talking about that. Not that, this discussion, this talk with our kids is not just for families of color. And I think that is really important for us to push forward. My family this year will be 50 years since my family came to this country. And again, this continued feeling of foreignness hangs over us. And that is something that I want to make sure doesn't last another 50 years. How we get that exactly and whether that is fully achievable, I don't have the answers to that all just yet, but we have to at least still try.
In much of our recent coverage in the news, we've sort of been focusing on these violent incidents that are horrifying, and there's video, and people can't believe it's happening. But you tweeted out something that I thought was so interesting. You said even when you worked for the State Department, right, you had to deal with bias, and you talked about receiving a letter saying that you could not deal with Korean issues and how sort of stunning that was to you. Can you just talk about that, how it made you feel, and whether, you know, even at that point, was it enough to make you think, okay, we have to have you know, an open discussion about this? Or, you know, as minorities, do we sometimes get used to this kind of behavior?
Yeah, when I worked at the State Department, I worked on issues related to Iraq. I served out in Afghanistan as a civilian advisor there. I had top secret security clearance, but one day I received a letter at my desk at State Department telling me that I was banned from working on issues related to Korea. I wasn't even trying to work on issues related to Korea. It was not like I was applying for something. So this was just proactive and preemptively telling me that my government did not trust me enough to work on some issues here simply because of my last name, simply because of my heritage. I was born here in the United States. I don't even really speak Korean very well. You know, so I just felt very disrespected. I felt like, you know, when you have this feeling that your country doesn't quite trust you enough, and that they're keeping their eye on you and sending you letters proactively and preemptively when I wasn't even considering a job, it was very disrespectful, and it hurt. And it really felt like this sense that I just can't fully be 100% American. If even when I'm willing to risk my life in Afghanistan and elsewhere, that they don't fully trust me. And look, I'd like to tell you that I was able to fix all these problems and get that sorted out. But you're right. Sometimes we don't fight all the fights that we need to. And I didn't raise enough at that time to fix that and showcase that this was disrespectful. Now that I'm in Congress and I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee that has oversight over the State Department, I will make sure that we fix this problem.
Congressman, I just have one more question on this subject before we move on to News of the Day, and it's a nuanced one. I wonder if the talk that we're explaining now and that we're talking about to our viewers that you are going to have with your children and other members of the AAPI community are going to have with their children is different from the experiences that those of us who are immigrants like myself have had with our parents. I was born in the late 60s, you were born in the early 80s, but I always felt that one of the things that our parents did as immigrants was they wanted us to assimilate as much as we could. They didn't want us to talk about the fact that we had parents from other countries or that we spoke another language in the house. They wanted us to speak English. They wanted us, and even if you came home and you said something to your parents, my parents, let me just put it in context of myself, about what you might have suspected was racist language, they would tell you, just put your head down and do your work, get good grades. That's your shield against any form of racism. We know now that's not particularly true. You can get straight A's, you can be in the United States military and still be treated by the police a certain way or by your employer a certain way. Do you think that that's led to sort of the fact that we're talking about this Asian American violence now in this country, part of the reason why it hasn't been covered as much is because of the way some of us of an earlier generation were perhaps raised by our elders?
Well, look, when I went down to Atlanta, I met with the families of the victims as well as the Asian American community down there. And they over and over again said, you know, we want to be seen. We want to be heard. We're tired of feeling invisible. We're tired of a society that puts this false mask over us about the model minority that has in so many ways, you know, damaged our ability to just be ourselves and be able to be seen and heard in that way. But also it does remind us that in order to be seen and heard, we have to speak out and be visible, which is why I've been sharing more about some of the personal experiences that I've had, which are very tough stories for me to tell. These are stories I haven't necessarily told before. So yes, we want to make sure that we are explaining and detailing what the bias, the discrimination, the racism against the AAPI community looks like, feels like. It is different than some of the bias and the racism that other communities face. But again, hate in all forms is something that we have to stand up against. But we also need to make sure that people are understanding and thinking about what it is that we're struggling with and not just changing the subject. And even in Congress, you know, we had a hearing about the violence against the Asian American community. And instead of talking about that, some of my colleagues would, again, just change the subject to something else. So we need to make sure that while we are speaking out and being visible, that others are taking time to listen and engage with us in a dialogue.
One quick question before you go on a different topic. You are a member of the Enforcement Caucus. We've had a number of incidents that have been making headlines that have to do with police use of force, in some cases deadly force. What is your committee focused on?
Well, I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee as well as the Foreign Affairs Committee, so I'm not part of a committee that is dealing with law enforcement domestically here. But what I will say is that we have passed in the House of Representatives the Justice in Policing Act, which is aimed at trying to reform some of these elements to be able to get towards the kind of fight against systemic racism and inequality that we need to. We're really pressing the Senate to be able to move that forward. And trying to make sure that we can deliver real reforms and real changes to be able to address these problems that we unfortunately continue to see in our streets every single day.
Congressman Andy Kim, sir, thank you so much for spending some time with us, and thank you for shedding light and sounding the clarion call on something that is for too long in this country been overlooked. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.